Hi everyone, it's hard to believe, but this is our last new unit of material for the semester. This will cover us for the next 2 weeks, weeks 12 and week 13. And this unit is about the natural world and science and art. For week 12, we're going to focus on images of nature and responses to the natural environment in ancient visual culture. And these are the guiding questions. How do artists respond to and incorporate elements of nature into their artworks? How are the natural world and religion interconnected in ancient art? We're going to see many different examples of that. And how do artists use natural materials in their artworks? So incorporating elements of nature, that might be the subject matter. That might be depicting the natural world in an artwork. But the third question brings up the idea too of using natural materials in terms of the artistic medium, in terms of perhaps the pigments, and often those choices hold a lot of significance. We are going to start again going way back here to the very beginning of human visual culture, and we're going to look at cave paintings. Cave art is found all around the world. We are looking at Chauvet Cave in France, but we have cave art found in Spain, Malta, Australia, Algeria. Oftentimes, and this is certainly the case with Chauvet Cave, the cave art is hidden very deep into a large network of caves, suggesting that it was intended for a privileged subset of people. This was not a place that lots of people came, that lots of people gathered. And that then suggests to us that this is a society built on a hierarchy, that there was a kind of structure and order to even the very earliest human civilizations. There's lots of questions about how these artworks were made. First of all, you're deep in a cave, so how do you see? And there's actually archaeological evidence deep in these caves of these tiny lamps that burned animal fat that would then illuminate the interior. The materials used to create these paintings are natural pigment derived from stone and plant material, sometimes charcoal too. And that paint was applied using either rough brushes or, interestingly, there's also these hollow reeds that have been found in caves with art that suggest to us that pigment was applied using the mouth, or that people would actually use those hollow reeds to spit the pigment onto the wall. The subject matter of this work is often animals. And here we see herds of bison, early forms of perhaps wild boar as well. And of course, in early human culture, animals were a source of food, a source of clothing, and the presence or lack thereof of large groups of animals was a kind of life or death scenario for these early groups of people. Let's look at the Hall of the Bulls in Lascaux Cave, again in France. These are some of the best known cave paintings. And much of what we know from this very early Upper Paleolithic, period comes from caves. Now, sometimes caves seem to be places of, kind of a place of exclusivity, as I mentioned before, but there is evidence that people did dwell in caves some of the time. That was maybe seasonal. These paintings were discovered on accident in the 19th century in an area of the cave not used for living quarters, but rather an area to which artists seem to return over and over again for thousands of years to paint. We have different layers of different images, paintings on top of paintings. There's many theories about why these paintings are not in the living quarters, but instead placed in the back of the cave. They possibly played a role in spirituality. They possibly had some connection to religious practice. Maybe it was maybe there were spiritual practices that were used as a way to kind of control the outcome of the hunt. However, that seems to be complicated by the fact that a lot of the animals depicted here were not the main food source of these Upper Paleolithic peoples. Here's a few details here so that we can see how these animals are being depicted. What's interesting is that there's no attempt made at using a consistent scale. Some animals are disproportionately larger to others. There's also no setting. The focus really is on the animal form itself. And when we look at the individual animals, they seem to be very naturalistic. As I said, the artists were using earth pigments ground from stones or from other natural materials that would be mixed with saliva, possibly spat onto the wall. There have also been some primitive bristled instruments in the cave, some early paintbrushes, and we know that artists also use the natural contours of the rock as part of their composition. So, for example, if a rock bows out, that might be used then to suggest the three-dimensionality of the form of the bull here. All right, just jumping a few tens of thousands of years into the future. We're going to focus here in our next section on East Asia. And in ancient China, we see the importance of landscape painting. And again, the connection of images of landscape connected to philosophical and religious worldviews. The artist here is a man named Fan Quan, who we don't really know much about, but he painted some of the most majestic landscape paintings of this Northern Sung period. And this work is really his masterpiece. It's an outstanding example of Chinese landscape painting. Long before European artists considered landscape to be a kind of subject in its own right. For centuries and centuries in Europe, landscape was just a setting for figures. It was never the focus. It was never the centerpiece that we see it here. And it's really Chinese painters who elevated landscape as a subject in its own right. And part of that is China's natural landscape. The heart of the Northern Sung dynasty was this area that was bounded by mountain ranges and bisected by two great rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. And so that, I think, location really played an important role in shaping the Chinese mind and character. The Chinese viewed mountains as sacred and imagined them as the abode of the immortals. And the term for landscape painting in Chinese, that I'm not even going to try and pronounce to you, is translated as mountain water painting. Fan Quan lived during a period of political upheaval, and so it's possible that there's some kind of deeper messages for us in these works. All right, let's look at some of the details here. Right at our eye level, at the bottom of this vertical hanging scroll, we see this big outcropping of boulders. And then just beyond them, one sees this area of boulders covered with trees. Look at all this crisp, very detailed brushwork. If we look very, very closely, we can see two figures of men on donkeys riding through with firewood, and they're kind of going through this partially forested area here, kind of in the middle ground. In the background, then, we have these massive central peaks that rise from a mist-filled chasm, and we see here, out of the mist rising, this massive mountain here with two smaller peaks on either side. The sheer height of that central peak is accentuated by a waterfall plummeting from a crevice near the summit, and that disappears into the narrow valley here on the right side of the image. The mountain form actually really does capture the geological traits of the southern Shaanxi and northwestern Henan provinces. And To model the mountains, Fan Quan uses incisive thickening and thinning contour strokes, textured with dots and then these washes of lighter ink. He really creates for us a lot of texture and a lot of detail without any use of color. This is a completely monochromatic image. And this work really does, I think, convey to us ideals of Taoism and also Neo-Confucianism, the important kind of philosophical, spiritual approaches in ancient China that really directed all life. Taoism is interested in this kind of in finding the way or the true path of life, and often that path is found with this within this harmonious view of nature and this kind of oneness between humans and the natural world. All right, we're going to look at some later landscape paintings from the Southern Sung dynasty. So this is about the 12th century, moving into the 13th century. I'm going to stop the video here though, and we're going to pick up with this in the second video.